your question spoke to the resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security being a product of the United Nations, which is a product of the nation-state system, and anything that comes out of the United Nations, particularly in the area of security, seems largely dependent on what member states will do. Some member states are very active in fulfilling the purposes of such resolutions, but all nation states are active in fulfillment insofar as they see it in their interests. So I once said, and I think Asha has quoted me saying, that national plans of action were a little bit like the fox's plan for watching the chicken coop. Because the nation state still is essentially a patriarchal structure. And even we know it is a fact that even in the member states where there is social, economic, political, legal equality between men and women, that equality is not fully operative in all spheres. The number of women represented in security policy making is still not much greater than at the time of passing 1325, even though we have had such landmarks as the woman Swedish foreign minister declaring a feminist foreign policy. But that foreign policy, feminist foreign policy, is very much a people's foreign policy. So the purpose of people's plans is first and foremost that the people, the women and men affected by 1325 will know what it is, will know what the intentions were, will see its relevance to their own lives, and then can begin to think about not merely how do we persuade the governments to implement it, which is that governments would do something that ultimately would come to the ground where it would be realized. But starting on the ground, where do we see possibilities for realizing? In our town council, in our village decision-making group, whatever is the governing body that has the most to do with our day-to-day lives together. How in many societies, lots of that is already working, that there are traditional ways of conflict resolution, but there might not be equal representation of women in those traditional ways. So, and there might be issues of protection and any of the four pillar issues, but it has to be seen as something that has relevance, not only at the state level, but at every level, because we're talking about an instrument that is intended ultimately to be transformative of the patriarchal power structures. So people's plans for actions are what people can do themselves, finding ways to empower people to do it. And as that process takes place, where it is appropriate to address government at each level, including the nation state level, but it can be done out of experience. They can say, don't tell us you're not going to allocate funds for this implementation because it won't work. It works. We've done it with this plan. And the main stumbling block for national plans of action have been that they've been shelved without funding. So they're there, but the funds are not allocated to implementing them. And it is where the funds are that the power is. So that also indicates that we have to find ways where we're not dependent. And these are kind of mini declarations of independence of people on the ground taking charge of their own lives. And that might be quixotic and idealistic, but every major change that has ever happened in human history ultimately has to be rooted in the ground or it doesn't last. So.
Right.
Well, I don't know if this is an answer as such, but this would be my response. You might not live in a war zone, but you live within the war system. And you live within political structures that have as a major factor in how they operate the assumption that force will ultimately can be used to resolve conflict, to enforce any decision of state, and so forth. So a lot of the problem that we have with 1325 and the notion of war zones and non-war zones and so forth is the way in which we think about security, which still is the notion of protection against enemies and achieving our desired results in conflicts. Any community, unless it is truly, truly a utopia, will have conflict. Much of that conflict will be gender conflict, even if it is subdued and not really articulated. We know it's there. We know that it's going to stay there until we find ways to surface it that are not destructive. And I think one of the ways to surface it is by taking up 1325 and raising the questions. Is this in any way relevant to our lives? Is this in any way relevant to this community? Mm-hmm. And the global network of women peacemakers have been doing that all over the world. And they find that there is great relevance. And they have been organizing mayors of small and big towns, mainly small towns, who are supporting 1325 in whatever form that community wants to implement it, and working through various levels of government. But I don't think I can emphasize too much, no matter what the issue is, the importance of the people being aware of the issues, the people understanding what the alternatives would be, the people themselves thinking about how do we formulate and implement alternatives, because the whole principle of democracy is that the citizens ultimately make the decisions by whom they elect or whatever. But those decisions are not going to be in their interests unless they know the issues and are making choices accordingly. So I don't think people's plans of action are going to revolutionize the world. But I do believe that they are one instrument for what Paulo Freire called conscientization, making the people aware of their own reality, encouraging the people to develop their own capacity to deal with and transform their own realities. Because everything tells us opposite. Everything tells us we are dependent. everything tells us the only way we're going to make it is by negotiating with the power structure, mainly on their terms. So I want it to be on the terms of the people as much as possible. I would do it not unlike the Landmines Treaty was formulated. That was formulated out of planning at a kitchen table by two women who are concerned about the landmines problem and seeing that there could be a treaty that would be one way to start dealing with it. So I think basically all you need is a group of concerned people. Number one, at least one of those people has to be literate. That person, if everyone can't read it, that person will sit with the group and read bit by bit 1325. They'll discuss it. They'll go back over it, all the bits. They'll put it together again. And then they'll say, how does this relate to our lives? And what do we want to change in our lives? What would that change look like? Okay, can somebody write? Write it down. Let's start to write our own plan. And it would be point by point relevant to village A or city B. This is what we think should happen. Then, this is what we can do to make it happen. Then, these are the people we need to work with to make it happen and make it stick. So you could do this in any community as long as you just keep the original purpose in mind and work with implementing that purpose on whatever scale you're working. I think you could do this with our kids in 6th grade or 11-year-olds. I think you could put them in clusters. You could put a resume of 1325 and tell them a little bit about how women were concerned about war and so forth, and have them do it as an exercise of making a plan. Then they could do a little simulation of how they would present it to another organization in the town. Then how would a group of organizations go to the town council if necessary? But it could be an instrument for learning about many aspects of civil society and government, as well as starting kids looking at the problems, not only as problems to be endured, but problems to be addressed. And understanding that to address them, they have to work together and help each other. And that's what the whole essence of the women's movement is, working together and helping each other toward the common goals. So that's the whole story of People's Plans for Action.